this is a very type of economy style way of protecting the
protecting academics from tripping over and hurting themselves. Much more valuable to us. Yeah, all right. Start get this ball rolling. Thank you. All right, so in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, spiritual connection to country, and in continuing ACU's commitment to reconciliation, it is customary to acknowledge country as we pass through. Today, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the First Peoples, the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways. We thank them for the continued custodianship. We also acknowledge and celebrate the continuation of a living culture that has a unique role in this region and on all campuses of Australian Capital University. We also acknowledge elders past and present and thank them for the wisdom and guidance as we walk in their footsteps. So I'd just like to hand this over now to Professor Herb Marsh to introduce our Brownbag speaker today. Thank you.
Well, we're really fortunate to have Georgia to be able to do the presentation. Originally, we were going to have Rhonda do it, but Rhonda is on leave. And so we looked around, and Georgia was clearly the obvious person to ask. Now, Georgia is not yet a superstar, but she's a superstar in the making. Her PhD was wonderful. She's got some good publications. She's an incredible team worker, and she's sort of holding together much of the Indigenous Research Program, and she's the Indigenous Research Program future. So with that, please, we look forward to your presentation. Thank you
so much, Herb. Thank you. That was very lovely. Try not to move off. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending my Brownbag presentation today and also online. So today I'm presenting deadly language programs, what works and the impact on primary and secondary school communities. Today I'll be just presenting, thank you, the Faculty of Health Science. I received my first internal grant this year, but I have also applied for an Australian Research Council Indigenous Discovery Grant, which of course is larger in scope and scale, but I'll just be presenting to you the systematic review study, and that's looking at schools that are teaching Indigenous languages to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, and looking at the impacts that these language programs have on Indigenous and non-Indigenous students' wellbeing and educational outcomes, as well as what enables a successful language program in the first place to help inform other schools across Australia who are looking to teach Indigenous language. However, before I commence, I'd also like to acknowledge country. As a proud Wailan and Gomeroi woman, I'd like to acknowledge that I am here presenting on Cambriangle country. I'd like to extend my respects to other countries that they're all on Aboriginal lands. I'd also like to acknowledge that the ongoing sovereignty that First Nations peoples have, languages, connection to culture, land and waterways. And yeah, I'd like to extend my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Okay, so the background of the research. So much of the literature and research shows that Indigenous languages in general are really important for an individual's well-being, for cultural expression, to improve people's self-esteem, autonomy, self-determination. So it's really important, particularly for Indigenous peoples and communities. It's about having that connection to culture. You know, without language, to some extent, you also don't have culture. And so language is so important. And it's important to also acknowledge that globally, Indigenous languages are at risk of extinction. Currently, in Australia context, prior to colonisation and invasion, there are over 250 plus Indigenous languages that were spoken fluently. But at the moment, only 120 of those languages are being spoken, and 90% of those 120 active languages are at risk, are endangered. And so it's a real social justice issue of our time, considering that language is so important for the well-being, not just for Indigenous people, but also, I guess, for in terms of non-Indigenous Australians, in terms of cultural appreciation and respect, and just having that motivation and that opportunity to learn language as well. Currently in New South Wales, so research shows that in the Department of Education, that more students are learning language. So only 14 primary and central schools were teaching an Aboriginal language. That was in 2014. But now there's 58 schools that are now teaching languages. So we're starting to see more support, more schools and education institutions that are teaching Indigenous language. And so that kind of led to this research topic, looking at what is the impact and to encouraging for more schools and education institutions to teach Indigenous language. I should also say, research, I'd like to also acknowledge too that one of our investigators, Professor Gilad Zuckerman, he was one of the investigators on our project, and he is an endangered languages professor at the University of Adelaide, and he's worked very closely with the Barngala community in South Australia. For 60 years, their language was, he used the term a sleeping beauty. In other words, it was dead, but he used that term. And so he actually found a dictionary of words that a German woman missionary had, and he actually went to the community and said, I actually know how to interpret this and put all the words together. Would you like me to help you reclaim your language? So reclamation and revitalisation is very different. Reclamation is when no one can speak a language, and revitalisation is when some members of the community can. And they said, yes, we'd love you to help reclaim our language. We've been waiting for you for 50 years. So really honoured to have Professor Zuckerman on our team and supporting us as a linguist. But yeah, just wanted to provide that context, and his research has definitely showed the correlation between learning a language and wellbeing. Okay, so like I said, there is a gap in knowledge, particularly there's not a lot of research that shows the impact on primary and secondary students' wellbeing. Whilst we know that languages are important for wellbeing, we do need more research to really help inform policy and practice, and of course to encourage the government to continue funding language programs in schools. So these are my research questions. I'll read them out to you. You might not be able to really see the slides clearly, but the first research question, of course, is looking at what does international literature identify as the enablers of a successful language program. Research question 2 is looking at the impact. So what are the educational and wellbeing impacts? And I'll define what defining wellbeing later on. But in terms of educational impacts, we're looking at things like self-concept, motivation, school attendance, engagement. And research question 3 is comparing language acquisition and wellbeing globally, and of course recognising if there's any differences across countries, both regions, and cultural and language contexts as well. And also looking at non-Indigenous students and parents' perspectives as well. And for my ARC grant, that's something that we're doing, is that we partner in schools, that 3 that do teach a language and the 3 that don't, as a comparison control school, and we'll be interviewing and hosting focus groups with non-Indigenous parents as well. So, of course, I'd like to acknowledge my position as a researcher. So not just in qualitative or Indigenous research, but in all research, it's really important as a researcher to position yourself. I recognise that my motives and intentions of this research is that I'm a proud Aboriginal woman. And so my passion is to see more schools teach Indigenous language. Personally, I did not grow up learning my own language, or did I have the opportunity to learn an Indigenous language at school. But the school that I was very fortunate to graduate from is teaching Wiradjuri language. They're located on Gadigal country, St Andrews Cathedral School, which is the Town Hall Station. So they're one of the schools that have been partnering with us on the grant, but I recognise that that was the motive behind my research, seeing their successful language program. They not only teach 50 Indigenous students, because that's what they've got in terms of their student cohort, but they actually teach over 400 non-Indigenous students, and to see the impact is just incredible. So this is, my positioning behind the research. And this is a photo of my grandmother's country. So prior to her and her siblings being forcibly removed, as some of you may know, stolen generations. I should recognise too that these government policies over time that have disrupted Indigenous peoples being able to have the right to speak a language and of course connecting to country and their family. And yeah, that's beautiful Beamont Reserve, and that's Wellwyn Country. That's not far from Durmush, New South Wales. Okay, so what are my theoretical perspectives? So of course, once we got our papers and we're looking to analyse the data, this is Matthew, going to be coding deductively. So this is the first model. This is the model of social emotional wellbeing. And this model was developed by Indigenous Psychologists Association a few years ago. It's currently being adapted, and it recognises Indigenous wellbeing as being holistic, multidimensional, but it has a strong emphasis on culture. So as you can see in the middle, the self is referring to the individual, and it recognises all of the factors around it as important to wellbeing. So things like connection to culture, country, community, of course, having a healthy mind, emotions, as well as having good physical health. And around it, it acknowledges the impacts of historical determinants, so the impact of government policies and laws on Indigenous people, and of course, looking at, say, for example, one's not being able to speak language, that has been impacted by historical determinants. And then the political determinants refers to policies, and social determinants refers to education, SES, employment, and all those factors as well. The outer layer refers to experiences, so every individual is different. And for my PhD research, I had the opportunity to show this model to youth across 4 universities. And for them, each of that model meant different things. Some people who had a strong cultural connection and identity said that, connection to country is really important and culture. But for other youth that didn't have that opportunity and are on that cultural journey, reconnecting with their cultural heritage, said that connection to country might look a little bit different. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that that's what the experience and expressions refers to and means. So every individual is different, at a different stage in their life, and all of these impacts and these factors all connect differently for different individuals. So this model will be informing our analysis and our understanding of, Indigenous students and non-Indigenous wellbeing. This model, as you all may know, was developed by colleagues, Marsh colleagues, and it's unique in that it provides an educational perspective, because obviously we're looking at Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in schools. And of course, whilst the social emotional wellbeing more emphasises on the importance of culture, this is also looking at culture, but it also looks at important things like academic wellbeing, the social, cultural, self and psychological and physical, and things like self-concept and all of that as well. So what are the procedures? So we formulated the research questions. We've designed the inclusion and exclusion criteria and keywords, and we're looking at literature between 1980 and 2023. And we need to register a Campbell collaboration at the moment. Probably Diego and I are searching databases as well. And of course, we commence forward and backward referencing and identifying any references in important and key papers. And then commence co-evidence. And of course, once we've got our papers, we're going to be assessing the quality of the papers, not just to CAFs, but also there's a new checklist now. It's called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Quality Appraisal Tool. And that recognises, it's like a checklist of questions that really gets researchers to think about things like Indigenous ethics. So has the researcher, understood and, does it really refer to the Indigenous people's benefit? Is it beneficial to Indigenous people? Is it co-designed? Have they had the, so all of those important key factors that looks at. So we're going to be assessing the quality of the papers to that. And of course, we'll be coding deductively to the 2 wellbeing models. And just a summary of the contribution and the significance of this research. So the aim, of course, is to identify the international enablers and strategies of successful language acquisition programs, and of course the benefits that it has on both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students' wellbeing and educational benefits. It also strengthens the evidence base and the need that Indigenous languages are important, they matter, and the hope that this will inform future policy and practice, encouraging governments to help fund and continuously fund language programs. Also, the aim is, of course, to improve children's language skills, education outcomes and wellbeing. And the final aim is enabling better intercultural understanding and relationship respect between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, as well as increased appreciation of Indigenous culture and language. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Tell me, of 120 language groups that are still active, so many of them have a written language, or is it the majority of them just oral language?
That's a really good question. I have to go and have a look at that. Yeah, I mean, my understanding is speaking orally, but in terms of writing, yeah, I'm assuming they're included both, but yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
But there's a problem with Indigenous languages that some of them are being spoken at the moment, but it is not documented. That means that there is no dictionary. Like Gerard Zimmerman's study, German people built a dictionary for the Indigenous people, and in fact, the Indigenous community didn't have a dictionary of their own language. So somebody else came in to help them to build that dictionary. But and then how do they use it? And there is another question. There's another, it complicates everything, because some of the researchers would say, okay, now wait, the dictionary have been validated that everything is correct in the dictionary. Now, if the dictionary is being used by everybody, then we assume that everything is correct there, right? But if there is something wrong there, now who is going to correct it? You know, then let's wait until the dictionary is being validated and then start teaching. But then other researchers say, no, you don't want to wait. You want to wait till the elders are all gone, then you will lose language. You have no chance at all. So it is a very complicated issue here. So I guess most of the indigenous languages are spoken. Like in China, there are many indigenous languages, and they are spoken. They don't have a written form. They don't have a dictionary of their own. So I think the same happens everywhere in the world. So that is why some of these indigenous languages die because they never survive.
I mean, at the moment, Wiradjuri language, which is the largest Aboriginal nation, and they have a dictionary. So senior Stan Grant, Stan Grant, the journalist, so his father helped reclaim the Wiradjuri language, and so they've got the dictionary, and I believe it's Charles CDU, I could be wrong, CDU University now teaches the language course. So that's an example of a language that's been reclaimed and then now revitalised. And for Warras and Andrews Community School, they have like Wiradjuri language books. So Associate Professor Lynette Riley, who's actually a graduate of IPPE, she's a Wiradjuri speaker, and so she's just recently published Wiradjuri works for students. So they're writing the language there. But yeah, I guess each language and community is up on a different stage. And like Alex says, it takes time, and elders are the ones with the knowledge and the wisdom, but also linguists are so important. So I guess it just shows the importance of teamwork, the linguists working on the linguist side of things, and the community are working together too. But I guess that's one of the challenges with schools, is it really requires the support of the community as well. And at the moment, like the Australian languages, Indigenous languages aren't mandatory, like the curriculum. So we've still got some time.
So let's say I want to teach my daughter language. She's too young to go to school. How do I go about it? Because like if you teach them from like really small, they'll be fluent in that way. How would I go about?
Yeah,
I mean resources.
I don't like this recommended to like learn the language that the country that you're on. You have to then find out where you live, where the the language has been reclaimed and or revitalised, and whether your local community have because there's language nests as well. I think like the government's created like language nests for each area, so there's a community of elders and language speakers that you can speak to and ask where what each language and where you're up to, and where there's opportunity for the school potentially to teach it. Preschools at the moment also teaching specific like words as well. Yeah, so be up to speaking to like your local community, or even reach out to your council, they might know.
Is your son going to be bilingual?
Oh well, I'm not, but I hope that the school that they go to, they would teach language. It might be up to me as well to learn my language, so that's my next goal. Personally,
What's your kind of exposure to the language yourself, Georgia? I'm really curious about stuff that's not particularly, not methodological or anything. I'm just interested. You know how across languages there are often concepts that just don't translate into English, and the like English language, Shakespearean language has massively changed over the last kind of 500 years or so. Are the languages subject to the same kind of evolution? And are there concepts in various Indigenous languages that just don't translate to English?
That's a really good question. I'm not the right person to answer. I feel like the best person would be a language speaker or a linguist, and I think Professor Zuckerman would be someone that would be a great brown bag presenter that we could invite to speak about those kind of questions. Yeah.
When I was at Oxford, I met a woman who was an anthropologist linguist, and she, using some of the kinds of things that people use to do genetic matching and following the genetics of where people, she did that with language, and she was able to trace from the original African origins of humans how people spread out on the basis of language usage rather than genetics. And I would think that would be a fascinating, beyond the scope of what a mere mortal could do, but fascinating to do with Indigenous languages as well. But I'm sure that there's lots and lots of crossover. And interesting to try to follow that. One of the questions that I had when I was looking at that, when you teach Indigenous languages, there must be some balance between teaching a few dominant languages that are broadly spoken, or teaching 120 different languages, each one so small, reach that it makes it difficult. I don't know what the answer to that is.
I'm not sure either. I mean, my understanding we're going to do gradually language, and that there's certain keywords that you teach, and we had Zuckerman visit us yesterday, and he said, even if the language, even if you don't have many like fluent speakers of that language, it's still important just to teach, even keywords. That's where that kind of gets that process of like revitalisation and that. So
Question of how you make them enduring, like a pragmatic, practical question, because I totally see the importance of preserving as many of them as possible. But if only a few people get each one, then the ability to carry those languages forward is so much harder. Whereas if you've got a big bunch of people who speak just few those languages, would be more likely to carry on. It's a tough balance between preservation as much as possible and preserving it for as long as possible.
Absolutely.
What about the language structure? So, example, how does Indigenous language work, in terms of grammatical structure and things like that? So I learned Chinese. I can speak Chinese, but I speak what you call broken Chinese because my brain is in English mode. So it's based on the grammatical construct of English. So how does that work in Indigenous language?
Not sure. That might be a linguist question again. Yeah. And that's why we all work together. We're passionate education, well-being, of course. But then you've got a linguist that's going to be able to answer all those questions. Yeah.
I was wondering, besides learning the languages in school, is there any like TV programs, like TV news that uses like languages, Aboriginal languages? I remember when I was little, I could still see TV news in my mother language, but and then they disappeared. I don't know why, if it's the same thing in Australia or
Yeah, so we do have a TV channel. It's called NITV, National Indigenous Television. I used to work with them for a little bit when I thought I wanted to be a journalist. Yeah, they have a bit of language and shows of language too. I mean, again, because, you know, Australia has so many nations, and that map, I don't know, I can bring it back up, but there was a map in on one of my slides that showed like the over 250 nation groups, and that's not accurate, that map too, because it's a Western interpretation, of course. But yeah, I mean, NITV, the word Yama means hello. It's familiar, right? Yeah, I can't remember the channel number, but I think it's 37 from memory. Could be wrong. But yeah, they do speak language, but of course not to the extent of fluent, because, you know, be then the fight of, oh, whose language do we broadcast, and you know what I mean? But of course, that's some of the challenges. But yeah, then ITV potentially. Yeah, and of course, I think channel 9 and 10 are now, when they're presenting the weather, they've got the city names and language as well, like Lorraine, Sydney, yeah, Meanjin, Brisbane, and of course, I think as well in the airports now, they've got the name. Yeah. Overarching Indigenous like that, but yeah, not specifically to a language group, but yeah. Yeah.
Like everyone having seen it, so I thought that was really nice.
Starting to see some changes nationally, which is good. Yeah.
To what extent would somebody speaking one version of an Indigenous language be able to be understood by other people that are teaching that speak another version?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because like, of course, there's like over 800 dialects, and I was talking to Gillard about this yesterday. Because, like, for example, where I'm from, it's Welland people, so they're in the middle of Wiradjuri, which is quite a revitalised language right there, but then it's also Gumillara. So I was saying, oh, I'm in between the two. Like, of course, different mob communities with the dialects are similar and they use the same word. So I know, for example, that Yama, which means hello in Wiradjuri, is also the same as Gumillara. So yeah, so some languages have shared words as well. Yeah.
Going back to the concept of well-being, how are you going to measure well-being?
Yeah, good question.
From baseline to.
Yeah, so for the ARC, so obviously the models, we're going to use that. But for the ARC, we are doing both mixed methods. So we're going to be deductively coding it to the well-being, but then we're going to have the surveys as well. So that's also for like the controlled schools. So schools that don't teach a language, of course, we want to see whether or not their well-being differs to schools that do teach a language. And so that'll be like educational outcomes, self-concept, motivation, but we'll be looking at both of those models. So culture, academic, social, yeah, those kind of concepts.
Is your end goal for all schools that teach the language that the country language, or just like because I can imagine if you're learning just the language that schools based on the country is on, that you wouldn't have a lot of speakers, and the children might not have that motivation to continue speaking that language beyond just learning at school.
Yeah, so at the moment, I know DRE, Department of Education, do encourage schools to teach the language that is the country that they're on, that they're located. But yeah, I think it doesn't hurt, right? But my understanding is like when you learn a language, also strengthens literacy elsewhere. You know, the research shows that, any language that anyone's like speaking also strengthens literacy. I'm sure Alex will be able to speak to that more. But yeah, so beyond the country that you're. But it's a good, you're lucky. You're able, the school community has the support of like local elders and language speakers, and whether there's a language nest or committee there, whether the language is being claimed.
In the systematic review, are you focused on articles that are specific to Australian, like areas and for Australian Indigenous languages?
Sure. Yeah.
Cool. And so do you have a sense of like, if there are examples you're expecting to see in different countries that have done this really well?
Yeah.
New Zealand jumps to mind.
Canada,
Yeah.
US.
So I'm into a Kiwi account. Everybody's culture. And then, yeah, so yeah, that's a piece.
Yeah, I'm thinking those kind of countries and nations. I guess we'll see, you know. See what the literature say. So,
Yeah, we want to do it internationally, but some of them, it is hard for some of the countries. You can't have data from somewhere like in Asia. It's hard to get those down there, and there is very little research in those areas.
But even though listing of the indigenous groups in different countries would be really fascinating, because it is, I guess almost all countries have a marginalized indigenous group.
Yeah.
That makes it quite interesting. I was quite surprised to see this in the most of these countries have an indigenous group that is very much marginalized.
Yeah.
But that's.
Yeah.
Generation.
Yeah, well,
These Asian people in the Netherlands, they're crazy and no one understands. But this is, yeah, it's fascinating. Absolutely, like, but they have lots of TV shows. And like, you're pretty like there's a large population. They have their own TV shows. You try and watch it. You're like, I picked out one or two things, but other than that, it's.
In Australia, like you mentioned, 120 languages or 240 nations. How does that compare to other indigenous populations around the world? It's like Australia's pretty
we're
big.
pretty big, and that's in terms of change as well. You know, political decisions is hard because every nation's got their own law. Like before colonisation, they had their own customs and laws, and yeah, so yeah, it's a lot.
are there other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you for everybody online. Right, have a great day. Oh, that's all right.